Wars are considered the world's biggest crisis decision. Taken in moments of crisis can change everything. Sometimes one decision can influence world history. In the war between Russia and Ukraine, there was a very unusual development. This event could change the course of the war. This extraordinary development has received considerable coverage in the Ukrainian press. The information we are receiving from the front line shows that everything has changed. Before we talk about this extraordinary event, we would like to give you a small. Our team has been working day and night to prepare these reports. You can contribute to independent journalism by supporting our team of experts. You can support our team by using the Super Thanks button and glove the video. The war between Russia and Ukraine is in every respect the most interesting war in history. Hundreds of articles will be written about what happened in this war. There are two things that make this war so special. First, it was the first time modern weapons of war were used. Modern radar systems, artificial intelligence-powered defense tools were tested in this war. But there was a more important weapon of all: drums. Bearer drums used by the Ukrainian army have completely changed the course of this war. Thanks to these drones produced using the most advanced the Ukrainian army gained a great military ID. Thousands of Russian tanks were destroyed by these drones. The Russian army could do nothing against the drones. The other thing that made this war special was its importance for world history. Not since the Second World War had there been such an open confrontation between the Eastern and Western blocs. Russia started a war to prevent Ukraine from joining. As a result of this war, NATO members sent large amounts of Ukraine. NATO weapons were used against Russian weapons. International political balances became very important in this war. The Russian army was in very bad shape. Since the beginning of the war, about 150,000 Russian soldiers have died. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been wounded. But there is something much more. Thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Some of the surrendered soldiers returned home. Others remained in Ukraine. Today's Ukrainian media reports were about these soldiers. Allegedly, the surrendered Russian soldiers decided to fight against the Russian army. And how could this happen? The Russian army is one of the largest in the world. It includes people from many different nationalities. But the vast majority of these soldiers do not support Putin's policy. After Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, many soldiers in the Russian army were very angry because Russian citizens and soldiers did not support this invasion. According to polls conducted in Russia, 65% of the people do not support Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It is estimated that this rate is higher in addition, Putin recruited another 300,000 Russian citizens after the mobilization decision and sent them to the war zone. After a short training, the vast majority of these soldiers did not want to fight. Moreover, they were very angry against Putin, who sent them to this war. Russian soldiers started tease on all fronts. Russian commanders used very harsh punishments to put down the tease. Some Russian soldiers tried a different method. The Ukrainian government was of the Russian soldiers' reluctance to fight. That's why it encouraged Russian soldiers to surrender. A special hotline called I Want to Live was set up for Russian soldiers to surrender. The Ukrainian army was assured that the safety of all Russian soldiers who surrendered would be guaranteed. This plan of the Ukrainian government worked, and thousands of Russian soldiers decided to pass. The surrendered Russian soldiers were first given hot meals and clean clothes. These soldiers were allowed to meet their families. Then the soldiers were interrogated. During this interrogation, Russian soldiers told everything they know about Putin's war plan. In this way, the Ukrainian army managed to decipher all of Putin's plans. Some of the Russian soldiers who were interrogated were very angry with Putin and their commanders. When the soldiers solved the hardship that the Ukrainian people were going through, they were very upset. They felt that this war must end as soon as possible. A group of surrendered Russian soldiers made a very brave decision. These soldiers decided to fight against the Russian. According to Ukrainian media reports, these soldiers are fighting against Putin's army and According to the allegations, this unit consists of sniper soldiers. The snipers focus on killing officers and commanders in the Russian army. In this way, they are planning to withdraw trouble of the Russian army from this region. The fighting in Mont has been going on for a long time. The Ukrainian army is shelving great resistance in this region. In its address to the Russian people, Putin said, and would soon be captured by the Russian army. The resistance of the Ukrainian army foiled Putin's plan. Because of this failure, criticism against Putin is constantly increasing. Putin is very angry because of this criticism. Putin ordered Russian commanders to seize Und as soon as possible. The most elite units of the Russian army are being sent to Bagu. It is also reported that troops of the Wagner Group are being sent back to Bag. According to Ukrainian Defense Ministry reports, more than 5,000 Wagner soldiers are estimated to have died in Bagu. The Ukrainian army is protecting this town with its best equipped soldiers. The 17th Tank Brigade, made up of the most experienced soldiers in the army, it's defending this town from occupation. The brigade's battalions used about 100 upgraded Ukrainian-built T-64BV tanks from the Cold War, with fast automatic loaders for the 125mm main gun. These tanks were equipped with modern optics by the tank factory in Kyiv. The Ukrainian army is making great efforts to completely remove Russians from these cities. Ukrainian officials emphasize that modern tanks are needed to better protect these cities. After the arrival of Leopard 2 tanks in back, the Russian army is expected to suffer another heavy defeat. The Ukrainian army needs more weapons to protect UN. So why is UN so important? The Russian army has been trying to reach Kyiv since the beginning of the war. Und has a very strategic position for the highways in Ukraine. After capturing Und, the Russian army wants to take tanks to Kyiv via highway. The Russian army needs to occupy Mont first to capture Kyiv, but the Ukrainian army manages to protect Kyiv van Und by Chauvin, a historic resistance. What do you think about Russian soldiers fighting against Putin's army? How do you think the fighting in Mont will? What do you think about the historic resistance of the Ukrainian army? What do you think about Western countries sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine? Do you think Western countries are supporting Ukraine enough? Next big intel. What are maps for? We can easily see the size of the world where we are and where we want to go on a map. Sometimes there are events that change these maps. Today the Ukrainian army managed to change the battle map once. The Russian army suffered a heavy loss. UK intelligence reports revealed just how important this event was. So what happened in Ukraine? Before answering this question, let's make a small reminder. You can use the super thanks button below the video to support our team for their hard work in preparing this content. Let's start. If you are ready. The Ukrainian army has long been fighting to liberate Russian-occupied territories. In recent days, this struggle has gained momentum. The Russian army has started to lose control over the occupied territories. The Russian army is forced to leave all the territories it's won in Ukraine. This is because the Ukrainian army is showing great success by conducting extraordinary operations. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry often makes statements about the outcome of these conflicts. These statements show how bad the situation of the Russian army. Today's statements were very upsetting for Putin. A map released today by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry showed Russia suffering extremely high losses in and Tickle Blast. The maps of the war have once again changed in favor of Ukraine. Russia organized operations on several fronts to occupy more territory. The Russian army launched attacks in 71 regions, such as Sliman, Buk, Nevsky, Diva. However, all of these attacks were repelled by the Ukrainian army. The Russian army suffered hundreds of casualties in these operations. It is estimated that 660 Russian soldiers were killed in these operations. The total number of soldiers killed in the Russian army is about 150,000. The Ukrainian army is on the verge of victory in fighting in Bakhmut today. During the fighting in Bakhmut, the Russian army suffered heavy losses. Hundreds of Russian soldiers were killed in this area as a result of successful operations of the Ukrainian army. In response, mercenaries of the Wagner group were sent to Mont. It is reported that 200 Russian soldiers of Wagner were killed in today's operation. Russia suffered a great loss of power in Mont. Russian commanders realized that they could no longer win the war in this. The Ukrainian army put up a historic resistance and managed to liberate Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army also captured areas used by Russian soldiers as positions. The bodies of Russian soldiers in these areas were handed over to Russia. The Ukrainian army pays close attention to ethical rules, even in wartime, but it is different for Russia. The Kremlin doesn't even count the number of dead Russian soldiers. The bodies of Russian soldiers are buried in a very strange way and are not handed over to their families. This attitude of the PRE is increasing the reluctance of Russian soldiers to fight. The Russian people are very worried about this. Russian citizens are living in great anxiety. This war is affecting Russia deeply. Almost one person from every family in Russia has died in this war. Russian people are also living in great poverty because of this war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been wounded in Russia since the beginning of the war. These soldiers are no longer able to work. It is also known that more than 1 million Russian citizens have left the country. Most of the people who have left their country, who were killed or wounded in the war, are young men. These people are working in many sectors. In Russia, they were the most important source of the Russian economy, but they can no longer participate in the Russian economy. This situation leads to a loss of qualified labor force in Russia. There is a huge decline in the number of engineers, academics, and doctors in Russia. The Russian people have a big problem, especially in getting healthcare. On the other hand, there is something else that is leading to a population decline in Russia. Alexei Rush, an independent Russian demographer, says that the birth rate in Russia has decreased by 10% according to Rush. The reason for this is the trauma experienced by the Russian citizens are very worried about the future. Also, everyone who follows the news in Russia sees the news of the death of soldiers. The psychology of the Russian people is in a very bad state. In addition, Western countries are increasing their sanctions against Russia every day. This is taking a huge toll on the Russian economy. Russia, which is in a bad economic situation, can no longer afford the cost of this war. The Russian army is also making losses on the battlefield. A Russian plane took off from Mossy Airport in Belarus when the Russian F-50 plane entered Ukrainian airspace. Drones took off. Ukrainian military drones attacked the Russian plane. The plane was soon heavily damaged, no longer able to fly. The Russian warplane tried to return to the airport, but because of the damage, it crashed while landing. One of the most expensive and effective aircraft in the Russian army has been neutralized. The Russian army manages to inflict enormous damage to the Ukrainian army using drones alone. The UK has also published a new report on the Ukrainian army's successes in the war. British intelligence is carefully following all developments in this war. Reports are published when critical developments occur. The report published today revealed that Ukraine has won a great victory. The British Ministry of Defense announced that Russia's 155th Marine, considered an elite infantry force within the Russian army, suffered a heavy defeat in the Eastern Diagnostic region. The Russian army wanted to win a major victory in this war. For this, the best soldiers of the Russian army were sent to the town of Valor. It was very important for the Russian army to capture this town because this town has a very important strategic. After capturing this town, the Russian army was aiming to advance towards the western or Ukraine, but the Ukrainian army managed to foil Russia's plans. When elite Russian troops arrived in this area, a big battle started. The Ukrainian army was prepared for this confrontation. They opened fire on the Russian army from trenches dug for this operette. The clashes continued for hours. During these clashes, the Ukrainian army also used drones as a result of the fire from the drones. The Russian army was completely helpless. It was visible in the drone cameras that Russian soldiers were experiencing great fear. Russian soldiers had difficulty even aiming because of this fear. After the success of the Ukrainian army, Russian commanders decided to. The Russian army has killed hundreds of soldiers since the beginning of the war to capture this town. The town of Volunteer became a graveyard for the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is not allowing Russia to advance on any front, fighting with great motivation. Ukrainian soldiers are fully confident that they will win this. The faith and hope of the Ukrainian people is also affecting the soldiers. The great resistance in Ukraine is admired by the whole world. The Ukrainian army is winning an important victory against Russia, one of the most numerous armies in the world. This extraordinary victory of Ukraine is changing world history. If Russia loses this war, the Eastern Bloc could collapse completely. This will change the entire international balance of power. Zelensky is about to become one of the most important leaders in the world history. What do you think about the Ukrainian army's achievements on the battle? Do you think the Ukrainian army will be able to win this war? What do you think about the fear experienced by the Russian soldiers when this war is over? Do you think the Ukrainian army will succeed in liberating all the cities occupied by Russia?